After reading the first Death Note volume for the first time, which includes the first 6 chapters of the entire manga, and looking at multiple people's take on Death Note and its characters, specifically the character of Light Yagami, I've come to the conclusion that almost no one understands the character of Light in terms of who he is, but most importantly, his internal contradiction. So with that being said, I thought I would go on an in-depth breakdown about who Light is. However, be sure to pay attention, and lastly, but most importantly, enjoy. The first chapter of Death Note is arguably the most important of the entire franchise, as it not only establishes the character of Light, but his motives and most importantly his moral obligation, code, and sets up this deontological versus consequentialist worldview, which I'll get into, that plays out until the end of the quite literal manga. During chapter 1, before Light even actually uses the Death Note itself, he questions his own moral worldview, asking himself if using the Death Note to essentially kill someone would be murder. He then begs the question and asks himself if it's okay, however only under the precondition that the person has no prior relation to himself at all. Light then brushes this off, thinking he's putting too much pressure on himself, and decides to leave the notebook alone. Just as he's about to, a news report about a criminal known as Kiryu Otoharada has taken multiple children under hostage. Light's boredom, which is also unironically the name of the chapter, gets the best of Light, and Light then tests out the Death Note, knowing its possible outcome, but again does it anyway. 40 seconds would then pass, and Kiryu is then suddenly dead. However, Light still doubts. During this first use of the Death Note, Light again is in moral conflict with himself, asking himself if it's okay to kill someone who ought to die, also implying and showing glimpses of Light's portrayal of objective morality within Death Note. Later on within that same chapter, Light then says that the world doesn't need people who commit crimes such as murder, theft, and multiple other degenerative things, and that the world would be better off without them. Just then, however, Light would then walk into a nearby comic book store and walk past a biker and thug known as Takuo Shibuimaru, who's harassing a nearby woman into sleeping with him unconsensually. Light would then see this and would then write his name within the Death Note and cite the cause of death being a traffic accident. 40 seconds would then pass and the accident would occur, and Takuo Shibuimaru would then inevitably die. This would erase all of Light's doubt about the Death Note and confirm that the Death Note is indeed real. Light then discusses it with himself, albeit only momentarily, would then admit that he has killed 2 people, but would then say that he was doing the world a favor, calling back to Light looking around and saying people who commit crimes and other degeneracies aren't needed in the world. Light even says as much, saying that the world needs to be cleaned up and that he alone with the Death Note now has the power to rule over it and execute this quote-unquote purging of the world. Fast forward 3 days later, Light would then have a conversation with Ryuk, the Shinigami who dropped the aforementioned Death Note in the first place, and then tells him his plan to pass quote-unquote righteous judgment on the people of the world. This statement alone is the author's, Sugumi Oba's, way of allowing moral realism and objectivity into the fictional world of Death Note. Moral realism is the view that there are facts about the matter, about which actions are right and which are wrong, about which things are good and which bad. But behind this bald statement lies a wealth of complexity. If one is a full-blown moral realist, which I'll get into, one probably accepts the following 3 claims. That A, there are objectively good and objectively bad claims, B, that there are objectively good and bad actions, and lastly, that there is objectively a difference between good and bad. However, these are all ethical statements, as these statements may assert that some particular action is right or wrong, which is the basis for all moral obligations and systems, and that these morals are opinions on what we think are right and wrong, which may or may not come from an external source, such as God. However, in this case, Light is God, which I'll get into. To get a better general understanding of what I'm talking about, if we were to make the claim that it can come from either an internal or external source, this can be categorized as meta-ethical, as it studies the nature of ethics and where it comes from, rather than the contrary of analyzing what makes an action morally permissible or impermissible, and Death Note does both. As Light himself is not only the source of the ethical and moral actions he perpetuates and quite literally executes on the world around him using the Death Note, but also evaluates what is objectively wrong and objectively right within the world of Death Note, at least with his eyes, which I think a lot of people just brush over or don't fully understand. Light again verbatim says that he will make the world inhabited by those that he only sees fit. I mean, I know people don't like to read in depth, but I don't know how much more blatant it can get than that when it comes to objective morality, moral realism, and the manga of Death Note. However, even with all this being said, this is Light's contradiction. Light, even up to volume 12, chapter 108, is the very thing he sought to destroy since the very first chapter. Light is the evil and unrighteousness he sought to purify, but let his pride get in the way of that. Speaking of pride, this is also the very reason the battle of pride against L in the second chapter, which is unironically called L, even happens. L puts Light's moral framework into question, calling him evil, and Light then freaks out and acts almost out of character, and once again due to pride, writes L, or at least the person who he thinks is L's name, Lind L. Taylor, in the Death Note. This was such a big blow to Light's personal ego and pride as a person, to the point where he looks almost insane and depressed, something that we haven't seen since the death of Takuo Shibuimaru earlier on within the series. L, in the Battle of Pride, would then figuratively score a point against Light, finding out where he's located, and in the final page of chapter 2, the two polar opposites who portray a form of idealistic dualism would claim that both of them are, in of themselves, righteous, and thus the game would begin.
Kira, I will hunt you down wherever you're hiding, and I will eliminate you. I am justice.
But what do these characters mean by righteousness? Well, we know that Light wants to exact an objective form of morality and perpetuates his own almost idealistic godly rule on the entirety of the world and govern it as he sees fit. But what about L? What is L's version of righteousness? In chapter 105, when Light is finally caught by the Japanese police task force, Light, and by extension the author Sugumi Oba, reverts and brings correlation to the first chapter of Death Note, and what I called into question, that being Light's very real and internal contradiction. Light says himself, and I quote, "That is the truth. In this world I am the law. I am the one maintaining order. Now I am justice, the world's only hope, the god of this new world." End quote. This quote goes back to the first chapter where Light verbatim says he will become the god of this new world he plans to create. Light then says once again that the world should be purged of those who are evil and that everyone deserves to be happy, and that once again he, along with Ryuk the Shinigami Eyes, and the Death Note, now has the power to do so. And once again, he is alone the god of the new world. However, here is where the righteousness of L comes in the form of Nate Rivers, also known as Nier. Nier is one of the two gifted children raised at Watari's Whammy's house and raised as one of L's potential successors. Light doesn't even know of his existence up until he shows up out of the blue, shattering Light's belief that he is free of L's influence. Nier responds to Light's moral declaration of moral superiority and supremacy by simply saying no. However, to be more specific, Nier says, and I quote, "Nobody can tell what is right and what is wrong, what is righteous and what is evil. Even if there is a God and I had his teachings before me, I would think it through and decide if that was right or wrong for myself. Nobody can tell what is right and what is wrong. Again, what is righteousness and what is evil. I am no different from you. I believe in what I think is right and what I believe that to be righteous." End quote. What Nier is saying is true and does shatter Light's perception of his own moral high ground. Even within everyday life, with figures such as Yahweh and Allah from both of their respective Abrahamic religions, individuals like us either devoting our entire lives to them or neglecting them. However, either way, we all question their teachings and or existence and try to gain a general consensus and personal connection on whether what they say is truly right or wrong, whether what they say or teach is either just or unjust, or like they would say in Death Note, righteous or unrighteous. Essentially, Nier is the audience's perspective of the entire story. Nier embodies what we and even the author Sugumi Oba would think about the story of Death Note from an outside third-person perspective. This is further extrapolated upon within the very next manga panel, and I quote, "You are no god, and I feel the whole idea of you setting the path for all the people to follow is neither peaceful nor righteous, and anybody who claims to be a god and kills people from left to right is definitely evil by my standards." End quote. Obviously, anyone in the real world who does kill would be perceived as bad, evil, and unrighteous, and anyone who stops the act of murder or is an obstacle within the sequence of events leading up to a murder would be perceived as good and righteous. And this is why it may seem easy to grasp that light is evil and L is good. But going back to what I said previously, light, even up to volume 12, chapter 108, is the very thing he sought to destroy since the very first chapter. Light is the evil and unrighteousness he sought to purify, but let his pride get in the way of that. Don't get me wrong, Light did change during these events and in between these two periods of times. We know this because he did in fact regret killing Takuo Shibuimaru. However, Light's motive was still the same, and who Light is or was internally was still a contradiction. However, to end off the video, let me ask you this. What do you think is righteousness?
Somebody has to do this! And when I first got that notebook all those years ago, I knew I had to do it. No, I was the only one who could. I understood that killing people was a crime. There was no other way. The world had to be fixed. A purpose given to me. Only I could do it. Who else could have done it and come this far? Would they have kept going? The only one who can create a new world is me.